All right, let's start video number 3 talking about field experiments. Field experiments are a little bit different than normal experiments, and we're going to talk about that. These are an attempt to have real-world conditions. We know one of the problems with experiments was that it wasn't like the real world. So what happens when you take an experiment into the real world? Literally, as this picture shows, in a field in this case, they are going to be less artificial, more real life like. And we'll look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. But the important thing is that it is not in a lab. The researcher goes out into the subject's turf, into the real world, and there is less control within these field experiments because of that. There's less artificiality. It's like the real world. Hopefully you can capture that real behavior, but there is less control. There could be other things that are influencing your subjects as well. Let's look at 3 advantages of field experiments. And I used to be an information officer for University Extension, and these are some University Extension people, and they would literally do research in the field, and my job was to write about it, and do press releases, and get stories in the news. So 3 advantages of field experiments. One, they have higher external validity than a regular lab experiment. Remember, we talked about what external validity was. They apply more to the real world. And number 2, they may also have less reactivity. In other words, they aren't reacting as much to equipment, to people in white coats. They are in their normal environment, and they are happy with that. Sometimes ad companies will send something to your home and say, would you watch this in your home? And send a survey to us about what you found and what you saw. And the reason they do that is if they have you come to a special theater where they have researchers, you might not act the same way you would if you were watching something on your own computer or your own television. Now, reactivity is when the subject reacts with the measurement device. So if you've ever had a photography session, sometimes you feel a little uncomfortable. They said just relax a little bit. That's reactivity. Sometimes it is if you are in a restaurant, somebody is watching you that you don't know, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's reacting to being observed. An advantage of field experiments is that they can be inexpensive. They still have costs, but sometimes they can be less expensive even than experiments because you don't have that expensive laboratory, and probably don't have the expensive equipment that might be needed. In fact, most field experiments require no special equipment. Let's look at 2 disadvantages of field experiments. First is it may be difficult to carry out. Second, outside permission may be difficult to get. Sometimes these are related. You can try to do an experiment in a natural environment, but it may be difficult to actually control that, to get a situation where you can rule out variables. Now, there are 2 types of field experiments. One that you are involved with and one that you simply observe. Let's look at the first, which is a manipulated. That is one you're involved with. It includes those in which the researcher manipulated the independent variable. Now, at one time there was some research which would not be allowed now, in which they had some people stage a fight as people were walking down on a street, and they wanted to see how the people reacted to that fight. Did they try to help the person? What did they do? And I don't know exactly how they did this. It seems like there are so many lawsuits in doing something like that. You sure couldn't get IRB approval on it. And they did that at one time. And I've actually, sometimes you watch these shows and some things on YouTube where they'll have something happen or somebody will do some crazy things and watch the reaction and try to get certain reactions from people. Some of those are a little bit strange and twisted, but that is the essence of a manipulated experiment. You're doing something to change the environment to see what happens. An example would be having a group without daily newspapers compared to a group with newspapers. Now you're observing both of those people. A second kind of field research is non-manipulated, a field experiment rather, is non-manipulated. That's pretty much what it sounds like. A situation is merely observed. You're just watching what happens. One example of that kind of experiment was observing a community about to get satellite television for the first time. This was quite a while ago, but not as long as you might think. This particular community lived in a valley, and they were not in place to get cable, or they were far from everything. They couldn't get cable, and they weren't in a really good position because of the mountains to get satellites. So they had a repeater set up, and for the first time, they were going to get satellite television in that community. Now, a study was done. Let me go back to that. A study was done in that particular case where they observed before and after and what happens, and that was an observation of what happens. Another example, a newspaper one time changed the amount of crime it covered. So they did a field experiment on this, and the readers believed that there was more crime in the area. So instead of talking a lot about what we call enterprise stories in the news about, this nursing home is closing that's been in the area for 170 years, they began to cover crime. And we have some crime in the area that's not covered. And so imagine what would happen if you were seeing no crime during the week and all of a sudden every night they were focusing on a crime story. Now, the thing is, crime had not gone up in the area, but the people thought there was more crime in the area. So when people would talk to them, they would say there has been an increase in crime just because there had been an increase in that particular media outlet in the coverage of crime that was there. Very interesting study. Let's take a look at online experiments. And wow, some of these are really good, but you have to be careful. Some of the places that do these for academic studies, they will do a lot for marketing, and advertising research sometimes has a different methods than basic academic research. It's based on academic research, but sometimes it's not as rigorous. So you do have to be careful with online experiments. But let's take a look at 7 advantages. First, they offer access to people who would not normally be accessible. Maybe somebody is disabled and not able to do some of those things. Maybe they wouldn't be able to reach certain areas, and there is a law to help make sure that that doesn't happen. But sometimes somebody might not be able to be accessible for those things and could participate in an online program. One example, I mentioned the disabled. Another would be the elderly, very elderly. 2, it may use a large sample size. If you are setting up a research experiment online, you can sometimes have get a lot of people involved in that, especially if you have multiple sites using that. You may get a very large sample size. There's definitely some trade-offs to that, but that is one of the possibilities. It's also available 24/7. If you have your survey available on a site, if you email somebody a link, then that's going to be available 24/7. If somebody works third shift, they're not going to be excluded because they were sleeping when something was done. An experiment was done when they needed to be someplace at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. So you might get people who would be otherwise excluded because of the time. Number 4, the experimenter need not be present. That has a number of advantages. You are giving the survey. The experimenter doesn't need to be there giving out each one. That has advantages of saving them time, and also it makes the administration of those surveys more consistent. Number 5, the cost may also be less. On the internet, it is often extremely or much cheaper than any other kind of surveys, and I've done both those kind. And while the internet is very attractive when it comes to cost, much more than having to print out books and surveys and try to get people to involve that way. Number 6, it's more convenient to the participants. They can be at home and just participate much like you are right now with this video. And number 7, it presents no possibility of experimenter bias. And remember before we talked about experimenter bias, but also that it frees up the experimenter, but the experimenter is not there to create bias and maybe accidentally or on purpose steer you into one direction. We are going to stop right there, and we will pick up right after this in our next video.